announcements. An upcoming event that will probably be of interest to many of you is a lecture sponsored by Associated Student Productions, the Cultural Center, and the Sonoma Student Union, and the Hillel Club here at Sonoma State University, and also the Santa Rosa Junior College Campus Activities Board. A lecture by a man named Floyd Cochran. The title of it is Ex-Skinhead Speaks Out. This man, Floyd Cochran, was the former chief recruiter for the group called the Aryan Nation. And let me just read you a couple of things about him. Floyd Cochran has been involved with white supremacist groups for more than 25 years. He left the Aryan Nation in Idaho in July 1992 after he was told that his son would have to be euthanized. At the time of his defection, Floyd was the chief spokesman and executive propagandist in charge of youth recruiting for the Aryan Nation. He has traveled the United States talking about the turnaround he made in his life. He even testified before the Montana State Senate earlier this year in support of a bill against malicious harassment that would make violent acts against gays and lesbians a criminal offense. Quote, only recently in life have I understood that it was not the world, or Jewish people, or blacks, or anyone else that oppressed me. It was me. That lecture is taking place Tuesday, March 21st. That's next Tuesday night, so go straight from here to there. Have a little dinner on your way. It starts at 8 p.m. at Burbank Auditorium at Santa Rosa JC. And it costs a little money, $5 for students and seniors, $8 for general. I'll leave this information up here for anyone who wants to read the whole thing. The Anne Frank exhibit continues at the Town Center Shopping Center in Corte Madera. It's going until April 7th. And especially students in the course here, but also those of you who are not students, must not miss the unique exhibit currently running in the Sonoma State Library, put together by John Steiner and Sandra Walton on the first and second floors in the area right next to the staircase. It is a marvelous record of events leading up to and through the Holocaust, replete with many unique items from the personal collection of John Steiner. A remark to students. Your response papers, of which you are responsible for 10 in the course of the semester, are to include a summary of the assigned readings, as well as of the lecture. And the impression of the instructors in the course is that often you appear not to have done the readings, or if you have done the readings, you often haven't summarized them. So be aware that that is a requirement of the course. The assigned readings are on the back of your syllabus in case you have forgotten where to find that indication of what is assigned for each week. And the amounts that we have assigned have been carefully chosen to be digestible. The midterm exam, which is coming up in a few weeks, will also draw heavily on the readings, so be forewarned. This Thursday, the day after tomorrow, will come the map quiz, and any of you who weren't able to make it to the discussion sections last Thursday, I have up here 15 more copies of the map, which will form the basis of the quiz, and also the list of locations that you will be expected to identify. So be sure to come and get those after the lecture if you didn't get them last Thursday. Here's our 50-year commemorative vignette for today. On or about today, 50 years ago, in 1945, the last Jew of Prague, Czechoslovakia, is deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, raising the number of Jews that were deported there to 46,067. Next week's lecture is the keynote address of our series this year. It's Mr. Leon Bass speaking on racism, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and African-American perspective. Mr. Bass is a retired high school principal from Philadelphia, and at age 19 or so, he was a among the first American troops to arrive at and to liberate the Buchenwald concentration camp in central Germany in 1945. That lecture will be taking place in person theater, not in this room. Please make note and spread the word. And I'd like to hand out, for you to help me circulate, leaflets telling about this event. I think it's going to be a block button, and it's the kind of thing that even people who haven't been coming to the other lectures in the series would be likely to be interested in. So I may pass these around and have you take one and spread the word to friends and acquaintances. Thank you very much. We are honored to have with us Nakano of the Japanese American Citizen League. George Oye, the liberator of Dachau, who was to accompany Ms. Nakano, has been unable to come because of the weather conditions. He would have had to drive up from Los Altos, and we all decided it would probably be wiser not to. But May has plenty of things to tell us about herself. 2 years ago, when I first heard the account that May and her fellow Japanese Americans gave of the way Japanese Americans in the western states of the United States were treated during World War II, I was saddened, strongly moved, and quite curious. I was curious what my parents had done at the time, what they had known about the deportation and the incarceration of the Japanese Americans, and what they had done. And so I called my dad, and I asked him precisely those questions. What did you know? How did it make you feel? What did you do? And what he told me, I imagine, was probably fairly typical. Now, my parents are social activists. You know, one of my earliest memories of them in public was of my father and mother going to bat for a black family in our church in San Francisco that was being refused permission to buy a house in a certain area of San Francisco. So I asked my dad, how much did you know, and so forth. And he said, well, what we knew, we read in the newspapers. What we felt was sorrow. We didn't know any Japanese people at the time. And what we did, and then he paused, and for maybe 6 or 7 seconds he said nothing. And then he said, what we did was nothing. And that upsets me very much. And it makes me wonder what I would have done if I had been in his shoes. And it makes me think that it would be a good thing for all of us, myself and you, to ask what actions we are taking and supporting, and to decide what actions we are going to take and going to support, so that when our kids ask us what we did to prevent human rights abuses, we don't have to answer that we did nothing. Formal introduction will be given by Walter Kuttner of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. My name is Walter Kuttner, as you heard. I'm a relatively recent member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust. I feel very privileged to introduce today's speaker, May Nakano. She was born in Colorado in 1924, first-generation American, one of 8 children of an Issei farmer and wife. As our speaker writes, her family, California in 1937, like Steinbeck's Joad family, crammed with all they owned on a truck. 5 years later, in 1942, the United States government relocated them all to the Amache concentration camp in Colorado. That's the time elapsed. She started college at age 41, and I stand in awe of all she accomplished in the intervening years, starting with outstanding BA and MA degrees from California University at Hayward. She tells us that she had one good husband, a senior, 3 children and 2 grandchildren. She's currently working on a novel based on her father's writing and spends most of her volunteer time in human rights works by lecturing and organizing. At the end of this week, she'll be a panelist in a symposium that is called 1945 Crucible of Deliverance at the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Texas Hill Country. May Nakano has been honored by numerous prestigious organizations, has lectured in many places in and outside California. Once before, in 1993, she was a speaker in the framework of these SSU Holocaust lectures, which is one of the reasons why she was asked to come back here today. Mrs. Nakano invited George Oye, as you heard. He can't make it because it's raining so hard in the South Bay. Mrs. Nakano has written and published extensively, including a children's book, Rico Rabbit, and is it Rico Rabbit? Rico Rabbit. And fiction besides numerous essays and scholarly works. Today, her subject is the Japanese-American World War II experience. And she told me that she will be very happy to answer questions after her lecture. It is a great thing to introduce Mrs. Nakano. Please help me welcome her to this booth.
Bless your soul for coming here in this rain. We really had it, haven't we? Well, whenever I'm asked to participate in this Holocaust lecture series, I am reminded of a quote from that outstanding human being, Elie Wiesel, who said on the occasion of the dedication of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, "It is important to keep this memory alive. And even more important, we should do something with that memory." He was, of course, talking about the Holocaust. And I'm sure that it is for that reason that these Holocaust series of lectures have been organized. And certainly it is my reason for being here today to talk about the Japanese-American experience during World War II. History is memory, and some of the films, like the one that you're about to see, are memory. And I hope that we keep the memory alive, not for the sake of depicting ourselves as victims, not for the sake of depicting some sensational event, but so that we can learn from it. And so that it will give us armor to guard against unacceptable kinds of breaches of our human rights. And of course, I think that we owe the Holocaust Study Center here at the Sonoma State University a great debt for their ongoing work in keeping the memory alive and for making us much more attentive and aware of issues about human rights. Well, we Japanese Americans here in Sonoma County and in California are finding many connections with the Jewish community, which our experiences in the concentration camps is just one. The second connection is, of course, the Japanese-American combat unit, which served in Europe and were among the first to be at the Dachau concentration camp. George Oye, whom you heard mentioned earlier, was going to be here to tell about that experience, but perhaps we'll be able to hear that some other time. The third connection is that we have lately learned of another story of heroism, and that is of Mr. Chiune Sugihara. He was a Japanese consul in Lithuania in 1932, And he was moved by the plight of thousands of Jews who came to him seeking exit visas to escape the advancing Nazi troops. And so he stayed up for days writing, handwriting those visas and defying orders from Tokyo. Mr. Kravis, who is here in the audience, and I and some other large group were able to be at a reception held for Mrs. Sugihara, who was in this country not long ago. At any rate, Sugihara's defiance of those orders from the front office enabled some 6,000 Jews to escape the country, and it cost him his position. So I'm hoping that we will be able to bring that story to you too, sometime in the near future. Well, while I speak about the connections between the Japanese Americans and the Jews, I hasten to add that I don't mean to suggest that the Japanese American experiences in camp were anything like those of Nazi Germany, either in scope or in the magnitude of the cruelty or the inhumanity that was inflicted on them. Nonetheless, I think that we should bear in mind that this incident happened here, in this country, and in modern times. We should take note also that even in a democratic society, people were imprisoned without legitimate cause, without trial, and without measurable public outcry. And we should bear in mind also that the Japanese Americans did sustain incalculable loss, as far as I can see, in terms of worth and as well as material well-being. But more important than that, I think that the injustice that we experienced as citizens goes beyond just that which we experienced. When the constitutional rights of any citizens are breached or violated in this country, I think that it undermines the very foundations of all of our rights, the rights that are promised us each as American citizens. Well, with that, let me announce here what today's program is going to look like, as I said, and as the introducer mentioned, one of the speakers is not here. So we will be seeing a short film, 30 minutes, by a director and filmmaker who is now in San Francisco. And after that, I will share some of my memories, personal memories of camp. And then we will have, if I don't go too long, we will have a question and answer period. Okay, so the film that you're about to see was produced by Stephen Okazaki, and he garnered the Academy Award for short documentaries for it in 1992. I think that you'll see that he's neatly captured here the emotional content of that camping experience, along with the objective facts. And also, you might note that the narrator says in the film that she had long ago given up hope that our story would be told. And I think that many of us believed that. We didn't think that our story would ever be told. And I think that's one of the reasons that it is so late in becoming part of our history. So here is that videotape called Days of Waiting.
Cara, it was so good hearing from you after all these years. I too have thought many times about our days in camp and the friends we had back then. Yes, I have considered writing about my experiences, my childhood, why I went to camp with Arthur, and what it was like during and after the war. So, for the record, this is my story. I was born in 1899 in Oakland, California. A year later, we moved to San Francisco, where Father worked as a landscape painter and piano tuner. Mother was an opera singer, a beautiful woman with a gorgeous voice. I rarely saw her. I never got to know her. A nurse took care of me. My parents had not wanted children. They were too old and too busy to take care of a child. I guess I was a mistake. When I was 12, we moved to Los Angeles, and my parents sent me to live with a procession of relatives and strangers. It was an unhappy time. I was raped by one of my guardians who threatened me in an institution if I told. Back then, people who caused trouble were put away. After high school, I ran away from home. I roamed the streets alone, looking for adventure. Those were wild years. Eventually, I settled down and went to art school. I wanted to be a painter, like my father. In 1929, I met Arthur Ishigo. It was love at first sight. Born in San Francisco, Arthur had moved to Los Angeles to become an actor. He got a few bit parts, but ended up as a janitor at Paramount Studios. It was against the law for Caucasian women to marry non-Caucasian men in California, so we drove down to Mexico for our wedding. My family disowned me for good this time. Those days, there was a lot of prejudice against marriages like ours, so we stayed in the Japanese community and tried not to draw attention to ourselves. To get away, we went camping in the mountains as often as we could. Those were good times. I was happy. The Japanese had immigrated to America before the turn of the century to make better lives for themselves and their children. They worked as miners, railroad workers, and farm hands. And by 1940, many of them had begun to prosper. That all came to an end in 1941. December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. Although there was not a single act of espionage or sabotage by a Japanese American, the newspapers and politicians cried for their removal and imprisonment. They voiced their loyalty to the United States, but no one would listen. On December 8th, one day after Pearl Harbor, Paramount discharged Arthur and all of the other Japanese Americans at the studio. 2 weeks later, I was fired from my job as a teacher at the Hollywood Art Center because of my Japanese name. We were American citizens, but we were treated as if we were the enemy. Under the cover of wild rumors and unjustified suspicions, the United States Western Defense Command declared that all persons of Japanese ancestry were to be placed under so-called protective arrest. Men, women, the elderly, elderly, even children with as little as 1/16 Japanese blood were commanded to leave the West Coast or be placed in concentration camps under Army supervision. More than 110,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of whom were American citizens, fell under these orders. Arthur and I were faced with the choice of separating or going into the camps together. I could not desert him. I wanted to stay with him, no matter what happened, no matter where we were sent. We'd been married for 13 years. Neither of us had ever felt a racial barrier, and now society was trying to create one. It seemed like a foul, musty thing dug up from the dark ages. 450 of us gathered at the church that early May morning. We stood in groups with our bundles and baskets piled at the curb. There was no way of knowing what we might need. We were allowed 100 pounds of baggage, no more. Those with more than their allotment had to leave their things lying in the street. It was all so weird and strange. I took out my notepad and began sketching. Kindly Red Cross women brought trays of hot coffee, but nothing could quell the bitter weeping of some of the evacuees. One young girl hid her face in her hands, began to cry, and was seized with a heart attack. Her family carried her into the church and stayed with her until she died. One at a time, the buses came. Armed military police stepped out and ordered us aboard. As we were driven through the city, a few bystanders stood on the street, staring and pointing at us, nodding their approval. We had no idea of where we were going or what would happen to us. Our new home was Pomona Assembly Center. Bewildered hundreds poured into the camp. Armed soldiers ordered us to line up to be searched. Photographers swarmed in to take our pictures, telling us to smile for the camera. Each family was given a number, a barrack assignment, and a mattress filled with straw. We were less than 25 miles from home, but it felt as if we were in a foreign land. Within a few weeks, more than 5,000 people were delivered to Pomona. We lived in horse stalls and cheap shacks, surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. Each day, we stood in great long lines to get food. Once inside, we ate hastily to make room for all the others hungrily peering in through the windows. There was rarely enough to eat. Some of the young people would run from one mess hall to another to get their fill. Later, we found out that our meat supplies were being diverted from us and sold outside of the camp. The War Relocation Authority organized an internal police force made up of cooperative camp internees. Every night, they searched the barracks, opened our doors, turned their flashlights on us. All who were able were assigned jobs to maintain the camp. Those who refused to work were blacklisted and threatened with being sent to the worst of the future camps. 19 of us volunteered to put together a camp bulletin, the Pomona Center News, with an old hand-turned mimeograph machine. We published stories about camp activities, trying to keep them upbeat, but realistic. Armistice Day, we went like prisoners to a fenced area where we could stand and talk for a short time. Under the watchful eyes of armed guards, we spent a few moments with friends and religious people from the outside. But this humiliating segregation, isolating us from our fellow Americans, was not enough. The time had come for us to be sent farther away. In August, we were shipped 1,000 miles to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Heart Mountain held 12,658 internees, living in hundreds of barracks in a square-mile enclosure. The people were half hungry and restless. Their feet trampled the earth into a fine dust within the fenced area. It was a city unto itself. Babies were born. Children went to school, made friends, lost friends. Young people learned to dance, fell in love, went off to war. The old people sat on the steps of their barracks, brooding, frustrated, their life efforts and hopes gone, waiting to once again live with human dignity. Some would die before the wait was over. A few grew desperate and took their own lives. I wanted to cry out, "Look what you've done. Why? It makes no sense at all." I hoarded scraps of paper and tried to write and draw what I saw. Perhaps one day someone would want to know. Heart Mountain lording over us as if it held the mystery of our destiny. Long lines of people waiting to be fed. Mothers with their children. The first snow in September. The icy winds and bitter cold. Shabby, shivering people with patches on their clothes. Christians, Catholics, and Buddhists gathering for Sunday services. Thousands of people with nothing to do but wait and watch the sunset. Then wait for the next day to begin. A mother and child gazing longingly at the distant horizon. Our homes and our country seemed so far away. Strange as it may sound, in this desolate, lonely place, I felt accepted for the first time in my life. The government had declared me a Japanese, and now I no longer saw myself as white, as a Hakujin. I was a Nihonjin, a Japanese American. My fellow Heart Mountain residents took me in as one of their own. We all shared the same pain, the same joys, the same hopes and desires, and I never encountered a single act of prejudice or discrimination. We had to make the best of a bad situation. I obtained a violin and joined the camp orchestra and theater troupe, the Heart Mountain Mandolin Band. When we gave performances, no one could miss me. I was the Hakujin with the white hair. The main thing was to keep busy. I found a camera and took pictures of the camp children. Arthur and I never had children. Arthur worked as a boiler man. Day and night, he shoveled coal to heat the camp's hot water. When we were first interned, Arthur was strong and alive. In 3.5 years, he seemed to have aged 20 years. He grew morose and sentimental. In the evening, he would sit quietly or play his bamboo flute, reminiscing and dreaming of what might have been.
A message from the Japanese government which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
The war ended in August of 1945. The nation celebrated and soldiers came home. The War Relocation Authority announced that Heart Mountain would close and that we would be able to leave. Suddenly, we were free. The government told us that we could go anywhere, do anything, take any kind of work we liked. The gate opened, but we had nowhere to go, nothing to go back to. I told Arthur I wanted to record the last day in camp, and he agreed. I hid the drawings I had already done, and we waited for the last train. On November 10th, 1945, we were given $25 and transportation fare. We were poorly clad, dirty. We marched like prisoners onto the waiting buses and trains. I felt like I was part of a defeated Indian tribe. When we arrived in Los Angeles, there was no friendly greeting or even a smile. Nearly 2,000 of us who could not find jobs or a place to live, who found it difficult to readjust to American society, were hustled into segregated makeshift trailer camps outside the city. We were surrounded by barbed wire, but this time the gate was open. As we moved from one trailer camp to another, I continued to draw and paint the Japanese American children I lived with. Some of them were ashamed of their heritage. They refused to speak the language of their grandparents and told strangers they were Chinese. Arthur and I took what work we could find to buy food and pay the rent. I worked at a cannery in San Pedro, while Arthur did odd jobs in Los Angeles. We lived in poverty for several years. I joined another Japanese-American band and continued to be part of the community. We provided entertainment at picnics, church programs, and community events. In 1948, the Attorney General was authorized to settle claims for the personal property losses we suffered. Arthur and I had made a list of everything we had lost when we were put in camp. We hoped to get at least $1,000. In 1952, the government offered us a settlement of $100. I decided that we should not accept this amount. And for the next 4 years, I lobbied and sent letters to every politician and civic leader I could think of. It was to no avail. In 1956, I finally gave up, and with tears in his eyes, Arthur accepted $102.50. 1 year later, on August 19th, 1957, Arthur passed away from cancer. He was 55 years old. It was strange. I had so much anger inside of me. I wanted to scream and cry, but I couldn't. After Arthur's death, I adopted a stray cat and moved into an apartment above a store where I could climb up onto the roof and watch the stars. "15 years later, the California Historical Society included my artwork in a show devoted to internment camp artists. I was amazed. I had long ago given up hope that our story would ever be told. During the run of the exhibit, I thought of Arthur, our days in Heart Mountain, all that we had been through, and I wept. Dear Carla, sometimes it's so hard to keep smiling, but I keep trying. With greetings and best wishes, Estelle Ishigo."
In 1983, a group of former Heart Mountain internees found Estelle Ishigo in a run-down basement apartment in Los Angeles. She was living on $5 a week for food and had lost both of her legs from gangrene. She was in a convalescent hospital in Hollywood.
or just because a nation is at war. In both the cases of the Jews and the Japanese Americans, the war just served as an instrument by which years and years of bigotry and hate, fired by the media, political propaganda, and demagoguery, could make possible those travesties. In fact, the unique generational pattern that exists in the Japanese American population today is solely due to the biased immigration policies that the United States government instituted very early on, beginning with the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907. May I just mention then, as an aside, that some of the machinations that occurred with the anti-Asian immigration not only remind me very much of the climate today and of the issues that go along with Proposition 187. In any case, because of these immigration restrictions, you can see very marked distinctions in the generations of Japanese Americans, at least through 3 generations. Unlike the rest of the U.S. population and the immigrant population, where the ages in the generations are fairly scattered and diffuse, Japanese American population has these kind of discrete groupings in their generations. And the age spread in these generations are rather small. This kind of phenomenon occurs nowhere but in the United States. And it came about because the Issei, which is the first generation, Japanese Americans, began to trickle into the United States around the turn of the century, as was mentioned in the film. And then due to anti-Asian agitation, particularly coming from California, the U.S. government began a series of anti-immigration laws, and which culminated, as I mentioned, in 1907 in the Gentleman's Agreement. And then in 1924, new immigration from Japan was stopped altogether. And so that this, of course, created a population of immigrants who were of a limited childbearing, and they bore children largely between 1910 and 1935, and that would be the second generation of Japanese Americans, of which I am a part. So you know I was born between 1910 and 1935. Well, these generational groups then have identifiable characteristics. So, for instance, we have in the immigration group, who are now all but gone, a group that never really learned to speak English and had more or less their culture intact. The younger ones of these are living today and are in their 90s. Now, the second generation, my generation, was largely bilingual and bicultural. We are called Nisei, and I am a part of that. We are now getting to be the age of, you might say, an endangered species. At the beginning of World War II, our median age was 17, and the vast majority of us was ordered into camp. Then there is the third generation called the Sansei, who were largely born in the 40s and the 50s. Typically, they speak no Japanese at all, and they are very much assimilated into the larger culture. A few, but not many, saw their first years in camp. One of our congressmen the removal of Japanese from the West Coast with relative ease and comfort, I guess you could say, on the part of the government. The Japanese communities on the West Coast then were fairly isolated from the rest of the society. And the Issei, as I mentioned, who were the leaders in the community, did not speak English. They were the ones who controlled the purse strings, and most of them who had any leadership role in the community were swooped up by the FBI directly after the bombing, and that was started on December the 8th. And that rendered the community, the Japanese community, relatively ineffective in terms of trying to mount any kind of a meaningful protest or gathering up support from the community. And as I mentioned, the part of the community that spoke Japanese, English, my generation were young and had no outreach into the community, no support. And so when the orders came down, we just kind of went into camp very much like sheep. Maybe be interested in some of the instructions that you saw posted up on the telephone poles there in the different parts of the city, which came to the Japanese Americans. It says, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following area. It marks out the area, and then it says, all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated from the above designated area by 12 o'clock noon, Tuesday, April the 7th, 1942. Now, I hope you took notice of that word, non-alien. It replaces citizens, of course. And then the following instructions must be observed. Evacuees must carry with them on departure from the reception center, which meant the center where we were going to be taken from. Each member should take with him bedding and linens, toilet articles, extra clothing, sufficient knives, forks, spoons, plates, and bowls and cups for each member of the family, and essential personal effects. All items carried must be securely packaged. And then it said the size and number of packages is limited to that which can be carried by the individual or family group. I think you noticed in the film that she mentioned 100 pounds. I can't see that a little child would be able to carry 100 pounds, so I think maybe that is an error. No contraband items was, as described in paragraph 6, public proclamation will be carried. Those items included mirrors, cameras, radios, any sharp instruments, and even family swords and art objects. Of course, the mirrors were so that you could not signal the enemy. The cameras and radios, you know what we would do with that. Later on, of course, this order was rescinded, and we were able to have mirrors and radios, and also cameras. Well, my life in the Amachi concentration camp, which was in Colorado, comes to my memory sometimes as a kind of surreal movie in slow-mo, because some of the events sort of escape rationality. You have to consider, for example, that the government forced us into concentration camps in 1942 as a danger to national security. Then in early 1943, began to accept volunteers into the armed services. And in 1944, began to draft men out of those same camps to defend that national security. My husband, who is sitting right here in front there, was one of those draftees. And here's another one of those ironies. As if to assuage their consciences, or probably more likely to check rebellion, camp officials allowed and even encouraged harmless recreation, as you again saw in the film, and entertainment in camp. But before long, the inmates were engaging in such things as cultural arts activities like Japanese dancing and drama, and later on informal language classes. You have to know that some of the men who were rounded up by the FBI directly after the bombing were taken simply because they were leaders in promoting the culture, Japanese culture. Most of the Japanese language school teachers were swooped up right after Pearl Harbor, and those who were leaders in the Japanese American associations, whose sole purpose was to promote Japanese culture, were taken. Also, another kind of bizarre thing was we were fed meals that really could be considered adequate, I think, under wartime strictures. But these meals were often, more often than not really, produced by the inmates and always prepared by them. But consider this. Camp officials often had to defend themselves to disgruntled citizens outside of camp who made charges of coddling and for this recreation and for this diet. And for this diet, I might mention that cost 36.8 cents a day for each person. At one time, Eleanor Roosevelt made a visit, her first visit to a camp in Arizona in April of 1943. And she said of this camp, "I saw no pampering or coddling. The Japanese themselves operate their own 7,000-acre farm, maintain schools and 2 factories. They made no complaint," she said, of the camp inmates. The only thing they asked for was a cooler that was needed at the hospital. When you think about that, you have to think, wait a minute, these kinds of charges of coddling that were made against the camp officials, isn't that the kind of charge you make against prison officials who have in their charge convicted criminals? That immediately comes to my mind. But I should mention, apart from that Mrs. Roosevelt herself was very sympathetic to the plight of the inmates and made very many visits to other camps to inspect conditions. I don't know how that sorted out at home with her husband, who had given the orders in the first place. Well, you can also gather from that film that our lives were patterned after the military, quite regimented. We went to the mess hall to eat at specified times, to the canteen for necessities, to the laundry room to wash, and which was next door to the latrine where we did our other necessities. We mail-ordered stuff from Sears, whatever we could save from our monthly salaries of $8, $12, and $16, depending on what expertise you had. We could go at the converted mess hall or see a movie of the likes of The Trail of the Vigilantes, or we could engage in some kind of sports and arts and crafts. Lots of arts and crafts. Well, I'm married. I was married, a child bride at 18, and I became a child mother at 19. Looking at it now, those totally out of whack day. But I think that war brings out a mentality that is very anxious, insecure, and totally out of whack. There were, in addition, rumors in 1943 that men were going to be drafted out of camp. We even found that believable. In any case, we rushed into marriage, my present husband and I, hoping somehow to find security in that, I think. Well, my husband was drafted. Shortly after the baby was born, to serve in Japan is another one of those bizarre things. To serve in Japan in the military intelligence service against the enemy, which included his father, mother, and sister who lived in Japan. I'd say that, and of course the Army knew that, and I'd say that the Army sort of went from no trust to way too much trust. Well, my overriding feeling in those days was one of having no control over my life. And you know, when you feel that you have no control, you become very ineffective as a human being. Sort of let forces take over. And I'm sure, like the Jews in the Nazi camps, if the authorities had come to take me to a death camp, I would have gone along. I would, of course, have hoped for the best, but I would have felt that I had no chance to comply. And it's amazing when you look at the history of those camps that there wasn't any more rebellion than those incidents, small incidents that occurred. Well, one incident during this period I see with some clarity. When my husband was at the training school in Minneapolis, I obtained clearance to leave the camp with my son. You were able to do that then. You had to be cleared by the government, and then you were able to go out if you had somebody out there that you could join, or if you had a job. And so, since he was in the military, I was able to do that. Well, when I got out of the camp, and I was aboard the train, all at once, I had this very serene consciousness of myself as a Japanese person, and myself with this Japanese face, and also with the knowledge that I have just been released from this prison. So I felt inexplicably as though I were guilty. And as if I, like Hester Prynne, you know, in the red letter, in the, what is the name of that? Scarlet Letter, yes. I felt as though I had this great J, red J, emblazoned on my breast. And I remember trying to huddle in a seat in the train and trying to make myself as invisible as possible. And you can take that for a state of mind. I think that for a long time that feeling resonated with me, and for many Japanese Americans like me. I made myself as inconspicuous as possible in society, and carried on sometimes as if in half apology. And as I said, I think that you can see how those years would have been sort of lived in limbo. It was only at the beginning of the 1960s, and I think this is important, when the liberation movement began to take hold, and it was okay for people of color to be who they were, that I began to reclaim my identity as a Japanese American. And I began to take possession of my own history. So that I think that from that point on, that was a incident or starting point of healing, and empowered me. And I felt so sorry when I looked at Well, I want to then leave you now with one more point. Here in the United States, a democracy, we have seen that, we see all the time, I think, that mistakes are made. Some are very tragic ones. In this case, the government incarcerated more than 120,000 people because of what they called a military necessity. This, of course, was countered many years later by a U.S. commission, study commission, which found that the causes were prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. But here in the United States, too, I think there is a hope. In our case, there was a hope for redress for wrongs committed. And that was only because the citizens made an outcry. Most of you know that Japanese Americans who went through the camp experience were presented a letter of apology and monetary redress in the amount of $2,000 in 1991. That, of course, could never make up for the years that most of us had lost. I probably 5 years. And the years that we had been deprived of our rights as American citizens. But it did make a very important statement. And I think that we should take note that it took nearly 50 years for this to happen, and only after a lot of citizens and civil rights groups had worked very hard to make this come about. And what it required was an informed, compassionate citizenry, a thing that was notably missing during World War II, as Professor Beard had mentioned. But I hope with these series and this visit today that we have contributed something toward that knowledge and that learning. Thank you. Well, I'll entertain some questions now, and I hope that you'll speak up because I don't hear really well. Yes. They were arrested. Thank you. They were arrested shortly, beginning in on December 8th. Without notice, they were arrested and taken to different camps from what the larger Japanese American population went to. And stayed there for sometimes a number of years, separated from their families. There was one in Crystal City, Texas, one in a place called Loop, Arizona, and other places. But relatively obscure. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah.
I was wondering if you knew anything about the possible internment camp on Angel Island in Bay.
An internment camp?
Is that what that was, Angel Island?
No, I don't think that was an internment camp. That was probably the way station for people immigrating into the United States. And many of them, for one reason or other, stayed there for a long time.
The other question I had was acknowledging the moral experiments put upon American citizens in World War II for military reasons, so we don't have to use the Japanese Americans that were in internment camps, radioactive experiments, or...
The question is whether radioactive experiments were carried on with the camp inmates, is that right? Not that I know of. Do you know something that I don't know?
Japanese citizens in other countries, like the one that I know about specifically is in Peru.
Yes.
Japanese citizens of that country, at the behest of the U.S. diplomatic service, were rounded up by the Peruvian police and sent to the United States, taken away from their families and sent to the United States to be incarcerated there. Do you know anything about this?
Yes. In fact, we have one of those refugees in this very county, was a chiropractor, was one of those people who was they were really hijacked from Peru and brought to this country again, to Crystal City, Texas. And they were held more or less as hostages to be traded with American prisoners in Japan. Yes. Yes? Speak loudly, Lily.
Their medical facilities for the camp inmates, as life did continue to go on for women who were giving birth or for people who became ill.
Yes.
Was there
you.
something?
I think you all heard that question. Yes, there were medical facilities and hospitals. Since I had a baby there, I know what that was, which was quite inadequate, of course, by even those standards. My sister had also a baby in camp and lost her baby because the doctor did not get there soon enough. And of course, there weren't enough qualified medical people there. We had a friend who was a pharmacist who acted more or less as a doctor at times. And certainly wasn't anything that would compare to, the concentration camps in Europe. But they were very, very lacking in expertise in the medical field. Put that letter.
I wonder if your husband would be willing to share his feelings about trying to carry out his job, as he was pulled out of his camp and sent to Japan to do whatever he was supposed to do there.
Oh, that would take another hour, I think. Would you just like to say how you felt about saying that? Or? One of you
Well, I don't know how to really say this, but at the time, I was politically naive, and I had personally something to prove because, going back a little bit on my history, I had promised my parents that I would go to Japan after I got out of high school. And sure enough, they didn't forget, and 1 week after graduation, I was on a ship to Japan. The only thing I didn't know at the time was that the minute I landed on Japanese soil, they claimed me as a citizen of their country. And I was told by my cousin, my father's cousin, that I would be drafted. My name was on the list because they have a family history. And which prompted me really to go to the American consulate and tell them my situation, that I had just arrived, and they tell me I was going to be drafted into the Japanese army. I could not speak the Japanese language. I could understand a few words through my parents, but that was the extent of my Japanese. And so they instructed me to either book a return passage or stay and take the consequences. And at that point I said, well, I'm not staying here because I was a foreigner in Japan. I couldn't understand what they were saying. And my limited Japanese knowledge just forbid me to stay. And I was young and raised in this country, and I wanted to come back. And so through much harassment from their harbor patrol, when I finally, 6 months later, I was booked to come back, the harbor patrol in Japan gave me such a bad time. I just turned everything off and says, I'm not staying. Regardless of which city, I'm not staying, and I came back. And the irony of that is that as I came back to California, 5 months prior to Pearl Harbor, I was told I was a unwanted citizen or whatever it was they classified me as. I went to the draft board, they gave me an alien number, and they said they got me on record, but then I couldn't participate in the draft. And
I think that his question was how you felt about going back to, as a military.
I'm sorry, I got sidetracked. But you're right. At the time, in the Army, they gave me a choice after the boot session. And they asked me if I wanted to go to the European theater or the Asian Pacific theater. And I said the European theater. And they denied my request and sent me to the intelligence. And they taught me Japanese in a very limited form, a crash course of what they did. And for 8 months, I studied very hard to learn what I could. I wasn't too proficient, but then I got enough knowledge to get by as an interpreter. And I think I kind of redeemed myself. And part where they denied me my stay in California kind of made me feel pretty good about that. Does that answer part of your question?
Thank you. I think that Shai sort of pointed up one of the things that Japanese felt during that time, which was that they really didn't feel as though they had a foothold in society. And they were very eager to do what they had to do to prove that they were loyal and prove that they were good citizens. And I think that was why many men volunteered from the Army, and many other people, although reluctantly, went out as draftees, and he was one. Okay, yes?
I think it would be interesting to know what happened in Hawaii, because if there was, I don't know if today Hawaii has a very large Japanese population, and I doubt that all happened after the war. It had a large Japanese population when the war started, right?
Yes.
And if there were any military reasons for this, do you think that the most strict measures would have been taken in Hawaii, but I somehow doubt it? What happened?
Well, apparently some people were put into concentration camps in Hawaii. But, if they put the entire Japanese population in camp in Hawaii, pre-war even, it would be a considerable amount of labor force. And I don't think that the population itself would have stood for that. So they didn't.
That sheds some light on the real reason on the why it was done, or rather, that if it was really done because somebody really believed it was military.
Oh, you need to sort of know the real motives, reasons behind it. I think there are multiple reasons behind the evacuation. One, as I mentioned, was racism, just pure and simple. And the second was economic reasons. There were a lot of farmers in California and on the West Coast and who felt very threatened by the Japanese. As was mentioned in the film, they were getting to the place where they were becoming rather prosperous and were able to buy land in the name of their citizen children. They weren't able to buy land themselves, but their citizens, they could buy it through their citizen children. And I think that they, in league with the unions, labor unions, made a powerful lobby against the Japanese.
Straightforward financial assets. If the Japanese citizens happened to have a decent amount of money in the bank, which
It was confiscated. I don't really know. They called it frozen assets. Directly after Pearl Harbor, all of those assets in the bank were frozen, and I have no idea. That's a good question. I'll have to find that out. Yes.
Could you say something about the outstanding performance of the Japanese soldiers? They had a special brigade, their achievement, I mean, that was outstanding in the war.
Yes, there was a segregated, again, unit called the 442nd, which was in Europe. I think they were the most decorated unit in history. Many of them, of course, died. They were assigned to rescue what they called the Lost Battalion that came from Texas, and in doing that, they lost a lot of lives. And also you could probably fill in here, in France, in Gruyère's France, they also liberated a city there. So they're well remembered there. I don't know very much about the military, so I'm sure I'm not answering that adequately. But there was a film the other night that was presented by Channel 5 called Honor Bound, presented by one of the newscasters, Wendy Hanamura. It's a film about her father, and he was in the 442nd. So if you have a chance to see that, you might want to check it out.
I'd like to add something. When I was inducted in Fort San Luis, Texas in 1943, a lot of the station troops were Japanese Americans. And I think at that time, at least the large amount of the military, the brass of the military, did not know yet if they would dare to send them into combat. So they were garrison troops. Of course, since we were in the schools, I don't know a good way of saying what they did, but they put us through the paces. It made us as good as I can say. And we were regular guys, and of course, in the army we have what you call a latrine movement, which is a totally unjustified way of interpreting things. And of course, we had it all figured out that the brass had these guys drill us so that we would begin to hate Japanese, which would send us to the Eastern Front. But of course, that wasn't the case. Just put them there because they were handy. Regular soldiers, and they did what all regular drill sergeants do when they drive in the airport.
Okay. Yes.
I was wondering, do you know what logic or rationale was used by the military or the State Department, or whoever it was, that decided where to draw the line between the Canadian border and the Mexican border, to the east of which Japanese Americans would not be incarcerated, to the west of which they would be if they chose not to find another, to find residence east of that line? How do you figure out, who were the suspicious ones and who weren't?
Well, I don't think they tried to discriminate who was suspicious and who was not. I mean, they were all under suspect. But I think that they decided that those that lived closest to the coast were the most dangerous. And I think that it went sort of up to the Nevada line. Is that right? I have a map here. And it was somewhat arbitrary. Because sometimes the person would be living, we know a family who lived on one side of this line, and if they moved on the other side, they wouldn't be taken, which is what they did. So, it was, though, the West Coast, and there were all kinds of signals were being sent to submarines, and that even the vegetable patches were being carved in such a way that they were sending signals to the enemy, and that's what happens in
May, just a comment. May mentioned about the prosperity of the Japanese farmers, the Japanese community in the country at that time. Something to remember. Upward mobile minorities will be feared by the majority and potential for genocide. The proof, you have the Armenians from 1895 to the massacre in 1915. You have the assimilated Jews in Germany. And you just heard about Japanese experience, and keep your eyes and ears open for what's happening now. Discuss this the students should discuss this in their groups. It's a good discussion.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Missing in action, right, thank you. Yes. My husband right there has a little part in it. I think that film belongs to the your film department here, and I believe that anybody who wants to see it can see it. It's called again Missing in Action. Thank you.
Just one other technical question about the details of what happened. Bill mentioned that at least on paper you were given a choice between being in prison or
We're given what?
The documentary mentioned a choice.
Yes.
Which is, I'm asking how real it was, between going to these internment camps or, I guess, moving to the East Coast. Was that a practical impossibility because they gave you no time to do it, or because there was no place for you to go in the East?
Good
And if you had
question.
it,
Yeah.
if everyone had done it, they would have closed that possibility off at once. Because they would have said, oh no, there's a Japanese movement going to Germany instead.
The question was that, well, it was kind of a statement.
Well, I mean, did you really have a chance?
Yes, when the exclusion orders were imminent, I'm not sure that it was horrible, but we all knew about this possibility that if we moved to a place like Colorado or the someplace in the bowels of the country, we might be able to avoid being taken into concentration camps. But nobody really had the money to do that. And what would you do during wartime as work? And people felt very insecure about that. Some of our friends did do that. They moved to places like Colorado and Chicago. Colorado was very good to Japanese Americans. History. What resident?
What percentage of the Japanese residents in the United States did not?
I don't know the exact percentage of people that did go, but the overwhelming majority lived on the West Coast at that time. So it would be, that who went. Very few did not experience it. One more question. Okay.
How did the Japanese government respond to the Japanese Americans that were living on the West Coast? Weren't they feeling that the small majority that were, or small minority that were living on the East Coast were being the West?
hunting camp would be a threat?
Yeah, it just seems like such a, fascination if you're so concerned about the Japanese on the West Coast. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, they're, really concerned about the welfare of whatnot, and then they don't remove the Japanese Americans from other parts of the United States. I would think that they would be very intrigued about how they respond to their, relatives in Japan. You know what I'm saying?
Sort of. Yes.
They didn't incarcerate Germans on the East Coast either.
Oh, that's right.
They were free to carry on their
I'm sure there was racism.
I just wasn't sure about what you were saying about the Japanese in Japan.
Japanese government in Japan.
Uh-huh.
Were they worried about their West Coast and their vegetable gardens?
In Japan?
In the Japanese government, were they at all concerned about Japanese Americans that were not in Germany?
Oh, I see. Didn't they care about the whole population? I don't